She had learned, somewhere in the accumulated experience of the previous 3 years, that the quality of an apology mattered less than its speed. Not the sincerity of it, not the accuracy of the explanation offered in its defense, but the sheer velocity with which it could be deployed between the moment a problem was registered and the moment it escalated into something worse. She had developed, in consequence, a particular talent for apology that was less about contrition and more about containment. A smooth, practiced delivery that acknowledged fault, offered no defensible target for further anger, and created the maximum possible conditions for the situation to resolve itself without additional cost to her. She had been using this talent for 3 years in her personal life and had, more recently, been deploying versions of it in her professional one, because the two had a way of bleeding into each other when you spend enough time in survival mode. And she had been in survival mode for long enough that she could no longer clearly remember what the alternative felt like. Her name was Simone Achebe, and she was 30 years old, and she was currently moving through the ground floor lobby of the Corsetti Tower on Michigan Avenue at a pace that was not quite a run and not quite a walk, but some urgent hybrid of the two. Carrying a leather document folio under her arm and her phone in her hand, and the specific expression of someone who has been doing rapid mental arithmetic about how late they are and has arrived at a number that requires immediate action. She was 22 minutes behind the time she had been given for her first meeting as the new financial compliance officer for Corsetti Holdings, and 22 minutes was not the kind of late that could be smoothed over with a competent apology and a confident demeanor, and she knew this. And the knowledge sat in her chest with the particular compressed weight of someone who understood that first impressions in powerful rooms were not rehearsable. She was a plus-size woman in her early 30s, carrying 235 pounds on a 5'5" frame that she had dressed this morning in a charcoal gray suit of the conservative cut she favored for professional settings, blazer that fell to the hip, wide-leg trousers, a dark silk blouse that covered her from collarbone to wrist, and low-heeled shoes that she had chosen specifically because she was going to be on her feet for most of the day and because anything higher than 2 inches was, today in particular, not an option she could afford. She had warm brown skin and natural hair pinned back severely at the nape of her neck and dark, large eyes that were currently doing the specific thing they did when she was managing multiple competing problems simultaneously, which was to say they were very still, very focused, and revealing precisely nothing of the internal calculation running behind them. She looked, to anyone who glanced at her crossing the lobby, like a professional woman running slightly late for a meeting. She did not look like a woman who had spent the previous 40 minutes sitting in a parked car outside a pharmacy 3 blocks away, holding a paper bag in her lap, waiting for the particular specific pain in her left hip and thigh to subside to a level that was manageable enough to walk on without the limp being obvious. It was not, this morning, manageable enough. She had known it would not be when she got out of the car and took the first 3 steps toward the building's entrance and felt the familiar, grinding protest of the injury she had been treating with ibuprofen and compression and the particular discipline of someone who had decided, with the ruthless pragmatism that characterized most of her current decisions, that the pain was simply not something she had the professional or logistical space to deal with properly at this particular moment in her life. She had been telling herself this for 6 weeks, since the night the injury had been acquired in circumstances she was not currently examining with any depth, and the injury had responded to this position by becoming incrementally worse in the way that injuries do when they are told to wait, which is to say with a steady, implacable insistence that eventually it would be heard regardless of how inconvenient the timing. She managed the lobby crossing and the elevator and the 43rd floor corridor with the controlled, deliberate gait of someone who had practiced managing a limp out of visibility, which she had, and by the time she reached the glass doors of the executive conference suite, she had reduced it to something she was fairly confident a casual observer would not immediately register. She pushed through the doors, crossed the threshold, and delivered her apology before she had fully taken in the room. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, to the room at large, with the clean, self-possessed delivery of the practiced apology that acknowledged fault without offering vulnerability. The situation on the Damon Avenue Bridge was completely blocked. I should have anticipated and left earlier. It won't happen again. She looked up from the folio she had been opening as she spoke, prepared to make eye contact with whoever in the room was going to be receiving this apology as the relevant authority, and found the room. It was a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows along the south wall that admitted the particular quality of morning light that Michigan Avenue produced on clear days, a quality that was almost architectural in its precision, falling in clean geometric blocks across the polished surface of a long mahogany table around which 8 people were seated, 7 of whom she registered as various grades of senior staff, whose names she had memorized from the organizational chart she had studied the previous evening. The 8th person was at the head of the table, and he was not on the organizational chart, because the organizational chart was a document that described the visible structure of Corsetti Holdings, and the man at the head of the table was not a component of any visible structure. She knew who he was in the specific way that anyone who had spent 3 weeks preparing for a position at Corsetti Holdings knew who he was, which was not from the organizational chart or the publicly available corporate filings or the LinkedIn profiles of the executive team, but from the careful, quiet reading she had done of the city's financial and legal press coverage over the previous decade, and from the particular quality of information that circulated in Chicago's professional accounting community about clients who required a specific kind of discretion. Marco Corsetti, 41 years old, if the public records were accurate, which she had learned not to assume. The 3rd generation of the Corsetti family to run Corsetti Holdings, which was a real estate and port management company of considerable legitimate scale, and which was also, in the understanding of everyone in Chicago who paid attention to such things, the structural foundation of one of the city's oldest and most methodically managed criminal organizations. He had run it since his father's retirement 12 years ago, and he had done so with a reputation for intelligence and control that was, even among people who would never willingly come within professional distance of him, grudgingly respected. He was physically, in the immediate reality of the conference room, more present than any documentation had prepared her for. Very tall, seated and still obviously above the eye level of most of the people at the table, with the kind of broad, dense build that a very good dark suit contained without disguising. Dark hair, sharp and serious features, a jaw that looked like it had made its mind up about something decades ago and had not revisited the decision since. His hands, resting flat on the mahogany table in front of him, were large and slightly scarred across the knuckles in the way that hands are scarred when they have been used for things beyond typing. And he wore no rings, no watch she could see from this distance, nothing that announced itself. His eyes, which had found her when she came through the door and had not left her face since, were a dark gray that was almost black in the conference room's morning light, and they were doing something she could not immediately categorize, something that was not the assessment she had steeled herself for, the evaluation of the late, plus-size new hire who had walked into a room full of powerful people and begun immediately apologizing. But something else, something more specific and more directed, and it unsettled her in a way she did not have time to examine. "Ms. Achabe," he said. His voice was a low, carrying baritone that moved through the room without effort, the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "Sit down." She sat, in the empty chair nearest the door that she understood was the one that had been left for her, and she opened her folio and arranged herself with the professional composure that was the one tool she currently had full access to, and she told herself that the apology had been received and the meeting was beginning, and that the next thing required of her was competence rather than contrition. What was required of her, as it turned out, was an audit summary of the 3rd quarter compliance reports for the Port Operations Division, which she had prepared in detail the previous evening and which she delivered with the clean, specific efficiency of someone who processed numbers with a precision that was not merely professional, but something closer to innate, the way some people hear music. She was good at this, had always been good at this, and the quality of being good at something had the particular virtue of making everything else temporarily irrelevant. The pain in her hip that she was managing with the careful, controlled stillness of someone who had learned that stillness reduced it, the awareness of Marco Corsetti's gaze that she felt at intervals throughout her presentation with the regularity of a tide, the persistent low-grade anxiety of someone performing competence. In a room where the cost of incompetence was not a performance review. She got through the summary in 11 minutes without looking at her notes more than twice, and when she finished, the room's quality of attention had shifted in the specific way that rooms shift when they have revised a prior assessment upward. Marco Corsetti said nothing during the summary. He listened with the complete, impassive stillness of someone who had developed the discipline of receiving information without responding to it in real time, which was, in her professional experience, one of the rarest and most significant capabilities a person in his position could possess. When she finished, he asked 3 questions, each one precise and directly targeted at the 3 places in her analysis where she had made judgment calls that could be interrogated, and she answered them without hesitation, because she had interrogated those same places herself the previous evening and had her reasoning prepared. He received the answers the same way he had received the summary, without visible response, with complete attention, and then he moved the meeting forward to the next agenda item, and Simone sat in her chair with her folio on the table in front of her and breathed very carefully and did not shift her weight, because shifting her weight in the direction of her left hip produced a pain that was, this morning, not manageable through breathing alone. The meeting ran an hour and 15 minutes. She remained in her chair for all of it, which was the right professional choice, and which also had the secondary benefit of keeping the limp out of the room. And when the meeting concluded and the staff began the process of gathering their materials and moving toward the door, she took her time organizing her folio with the specific deliberateness of someone who is waiting for enough clearance in the room to stand and move without being directly observed. She was not quick enough. Marco Corsetti was not moving toward the door. He was standing at the window with his phone in his hand, and when the last of the other staff cleared the threshold and the door closed behind them, he turned, and he watched her stand up. She stood with the controlled care she had developed over 6 weeks, transferring her weight with a precision that minimized the visible evidence of the problem, and she managed the first 2 steps toward the door with a composure that she was fairly certain passed for normal gait under casual observation. It did not pass for normal gait under the observation currently being applied to it, and she understood this in the fraction of a second before he spoke. "Stop," he said. One word, quiet and absolute. She stopped. Her back was partially to him, which was the wrong position for the conversation she had just understood she was about to have, and she turned, which required a movement of her left hip that she did not fully manage to conceal at this range and this angle, and she turned to face him with her folio under her arm and her professional composure assembled as completely as it was going to get under the circumstances, and she said, "Mr. Corsetti, is there something else you need from the compliance report?" He was not looking at the folio. He was looking at the way she had turned, at the precise quality of movement, or rather the quality of its restriction, which she had spent 6 weeks learning to minimize and which had just, in the movement of turning from a standing position without the benefit of the table's edge to manage her weight distribution, expressed itself with more clarity than she had managed to contain. His face had done something she had not seen it do during the hour and 15 minutes of the meeting, something that moved through the severe, controlled features with the speed of something that bypassed the usual management process and arrived at the surface before it could be redirected. It was there for less than 2 seconds, and then it was controlled again, but she had seen it. And she was a woman who had been reading the faces of men who managed their expressions carefully for 3 years, and she knew what she had seen. "How long have you been walking on that?" he said. "I'm not sure what you're." "Ms. Achebe," he said, with the same quiet tone he had used for everything, the tone that was not loud and was not threatening in any conventional sense, and that somehow communicated the complete absence of any possibility that the conversation was going to proceed along the lines she was trying to direct it. "I watched you sit in that chair for an hour and 15 minutes without shifting your weight once. I watched you stand up the way people stand up when standing up costs them something. I watched you turn just now. I'm asking you how long." The directness of it, the sheer specific accuracy of it, dismantled the deflection she had been reaching for before she could complete the reach. She looked at him across the conference room with its morning light and its polished mahogany and the particular quality of silence that follows when a room empties of everyone except the 2 people who have something that needs to be said, and she made a rapid assessment of her available options and found them reduced to 1. 6 weeks, she said. The thing that moved through his face this time was slower and more controlled, but it was there, and it was the same thing she had seen a moment ago, and she identified it now more precisely than she had the first time. It was anger, the contained and decided kind, and it was not directed at her. "What happened 6 weeks ago?" he said. She looked at him. She looked at the severe, certain face and the dark gray eyes that were doing the same thing they had been doing since she walked through the door, which was looking at her with the specific quality of someone who had already decided they were going to see what was actually there rather than the surface arrangement of it. And she made the second assessment of her available options and found them, again, reduced to one. An accident, she said, which was the word she had been using for 6 weeks, the word that was technically not a lie and was also not the truth, and which she used now with the particular flatness of someone who has said a word so many times it has worn smooth of everything except its most literal meaning. He looked at her for a long moment. He did not say the word was insufficient. He did not say he knew it was insufficient. He said, "You're not going to walk out of this building on that hip without someone looking at it first." He said it the way he said everything, as a statement of what was going to be true rather than a negotiation about what might be. "I appreciate the concern," she said, with the professional distance she deployed for situations that threatened to exceed their designated professional parameters. "But I have 3 more meetings this afternoon, and I'm already behind the meetings will wait," he said. He moved to the conference room door, which was a motion she registered as significant because it meant he was not going anywhere, was in fact making the room smaller rather than larger, creating a context in which the conversation was going to continue rather than conclude. He opened the door and said something in a low voice to whoever was in the corridor outside. She heard only the low register of it, not the words, and then he closed the door and turned back to her. "Sit down, Ms. Achebe." She sat, because the standing was costing her, and because the alternative required a resistance she was not currently capable of mustering against someone who had just demonstrated that he paid closer attention than she had built her containment strategy to account for. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat in it, which was not what she had expected, and the proximity of it, the conference table between them still, but narrowed now, the full width of it rather than the length, changed the quality of the conversation space in a way that required adjustment. "Tell me what happened 6 weeks ago," he said. "Not the word you've been using for it. What actually happened?" The silence that followed was the kind she had learned to manage by filling it quickly with something controlled, and she reached for the fill and found the well of it, for the first time in 3 years, dry. She sat across from Marco Corsetti in the morning light of the 43rd floor conference room, and she felt the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying a weight that is heavier than she has allowed anyone to see. And she felt the specific, disorienting sensation of someone looking at her with the genuine intention of seeing it. And the combination of these two things produced something she had not experienced in long enough that she had stopped expecting it, the particular pressure behind the eyes that preceded something she was absolutely not going to do in a corporate conference room on her first day of employment. She controlled it. She had been controlling things for 3 years, and she was very good at it. "I fell," she said, "down the stairs at my apartment building. I landed badly on my left hip and thigh. I should have had it looked at properly, and I didn't. Because the timing was," she paused, because the end of that sentence contained the truth of the timing, which was that the timing had been the same night she had finally, with the combined force of 3 years of accumulated decision, left the apartment she shared with her boyfriend of 4 years, and that the fall had not been a fall in the way that falls are falls, which was an accident, a loss of footing, a failure of physics, but was instead the particular kind of fall that happens when someone else applies force to your body in a direction that contains a staircase. And she had called it a fall, because calling it that was the only way she had been able to keep moving, keep packing, keep driving to her sister's apartment in Wicker Park with 2 bags and her work files, and the specific numb efficiency of someone who has just used the last of their courage and has nothing left for anything except the next immediate step. "The timing was difficult," she said. Marco Corsetti looked at her across the table. The conference room was very quiet. The city spread out behind him through the south windows in the particular clarity of a spring morning, and the light came across the mahogany between them at an angle that showed everything without flattery, and he looked at her with those dark gray eyes that had been looking at her since she walked through the door and had apparently been seeing something she had not understood she was showing. "You didn't fall," he said, quietly, without interrogation in it. Not a question, not an accusation, simply the statement of what he had understood, offered plainly, leaving her the option to confirm it or deny it. She did not deny it. She looked at the table surface between them, at the polished mahogany grain, and she said, with the flatness that was what remained of her voice when it had been stripped of everything she usually used it to manage, "No." The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. When she looked up, His face had completed the process she had watched begin twice in the last 20 minutes. And what it had arrived at was something that was very still and very decided, and from which the temperature had been entirely removed, not in the way of coldness, but in the way of something that had been processed past the point where temperature was the relevant quality. He was looking at the table's surface, and then he was looking at her, and his hands on the table were completely still in the way that hands are still when the person they belong to has made a decision that forecloses the agitation that precedes decision. His name, he said. 2 words. In the quiet of the conference room, in the morning light, delivered in the same even, unhurried baritone that had conducted the entire meeting, they landed with a weight that was disproportionate to their number and their volume, because of the specific quality of what was underneath them. Not rage, not threat in the theatrical sense, but the very particular register of someone who has already determined an outcome and is now requesting the single piece of administrative information required to execute it. She had heard many kinds of dangerous in 3 years. She recognized this one. Mr. Corsetti, she said. I appreciate. His name, he said again. The same volume, the same register, with a patience that was somehow more absolute than urgency would have been. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had known for 1 hour and 15 minutes plus the 22 minutes she had been late, and the current duration of this conversation. This man she had spent 3 weeks preparing to work for and had understood, in the abstract way of professional due diligence, was not a person whose world operated by the same rules as the world she inhabited, and she thought about 6 weeks of managing a walk that did not look like a limp and 3 years of managing a life that did not look like what it was. And she thought about the staircase and the 2 bags and her sister's fold-out couch and the 4-week-old bruise on her left hip and thigh that the compression wrap helped and the ibuprofen helped and the very specific discipline of never shifting her weight in the wrong direction helped, and which was nonetheless, 6 weeks later, still there, still making its presence known, still requiring management she had never stopped to properly receive, because receiving it properly would have required stopping, and she had not been able to stop. Damien Rowe, she said. Marco Corsetti said nothing for a moment. He looked at her face, and she looked back at him, and the conference room held them both in its particular morning light. And then he stood up, and he moved to the door, and he opened it, and this time she could hear the words, because he did not lower his voice for them, because he was speaking to someone who worked for him and who had, she understood now, been standing just outside the door for the entire duration of the conversation. Get Dr. Vasquez up here, he said. Conference room 4. Now he paused. And get me a name check on Damien Rowe. Full profile. I want it in 20 minutes. He came back to the table and sat down. And he looked at her. And the quality of his expression was not the expression of someone who had just done a dramatic thing and was aware of having done it. It was the expression of someone who had done a necessary thing and had moved immediately to the next necessary thing, which was apparently sitting across from her in a conference room until a physician arrived. You have 3 meetings this afternoon, he said. You'll have them. After Dr. Vasquez clears you, or after she tells us what you actually need, which may or may not include meetings today, he paused. The compliance work doesn't go anywhere. You've already demonstrated this morning that you're exactly what the position required. That evaluation is complete. He looked at her with the dark, unambiguous steadiness she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he had decided mattered. What is not complete is the other thing. The 6 weeks of the other thing. She looked at him. She had no prepared response for this, which was a state she was not accustomed to, and the absence of the prepared response left her in direct contact with the reality of the moment, which was that she was sitting in a conference room on the 43rd floor of a building that bore the name of the man across from her, on her first day of a position she had accepted because it paid enough to make the logistics of leaving the previous 3 years financially survivable. And that man had just ordered a doctor and a background check in the same sentence, and had done both with the same even, unhurried certainty with which he conducted everything else, and she could not identify, in the entire vocabulary of her experience, the correct response to any of it. Why? She said, because it was the most honest question available to her. He looked at her for a moment, and the something in his face that she had been trying to categorize since she walked through the door shifted slightly, becoming more visible, though it remained controlled. Because you walked into this room 22 minutes late and apologized before you had fully entered it, he said. Because you sat for an hour and 15 minutes without moving in a way that cost you more than it costs most people to sit still for an hour and 15 minutes. Because you gave me an audit summary that demonstrated a quality of mind that I have been trying to find in a compliance officer for 2 years, and that quality of mind has been going to work every day for 6 weeks on a hip injury that should have been treated 6 weeks ago, and has not been treated because at some point in the previous 3 years you learned that stopping to take care of yourself was not a resource that was available to you. He paused, and the pause had the weight of everything that was in it, which was considerable. That's why. The physician, Dr. Vasquez, arrived 12 minutes later, a compact woman of perhaps 50 with an efficient bearing and a medical bag, and the specific manner of someone who had been called to this building before and understood both the discretion required and the directness that was expected. She examined Simone's hip and thigh in the conference room with a clinical thoroughness that was impersonal in the way that competent medical attention is impersonal, which is to say entirely, and she said, when she was finished, that the injury was a significant soft tissue trauma with possible involvement of the iliotibial band that had been walked on for 6 weeks without proper treatment, and that Simone needed imaging and physical therapy and appropriate pain management and rest, and that she was going to arrange all of these things. And she said all of this to Simone directly and then looked at Marco Corsetti with a quality of professional communication that needed no words. He received it with a nod that indicated he understood every element of the subtext. After Dr. Vasquez left, with an appointment card and a referral and a prescription that Simone accepted with the dazed composure of someone receiving information in a language they understand individually but cannot process as a whole sentence, the conference room was quiet again, and Marco Corsetti was standing at the window looking at the city, and Simone sat at the table with the appointment card in her hand, and the particular quality of exhaustion that is not tiredness, but the specific kind of weight that lifts when a thing that has been held too long is finally set down, and she felt it move through her, and she did not try to manage it into something more presentable. The meetings this afternoon, she said, will be rescheduled, he said, without turning from the window. You have an imaging appointment at 2 o'clock. Marcus will drive you. A pause. Marcus is my driver. He's reliable, and he doesn't ask unnecessary questions. She looked at the appointment card. She looked at the back of Marco Corsetti, standing at the window with the city spread out behind him in the spring light. She thought about 3 years, and she thought about 6 weeks, and she thought about the word accident and what it had been doing in the place of a different word, and she thought about what it cost a person to maintain a substitution like that over a sustained period, and she thought about what it felt like when someone looked at the substitution and named the thing underneath it without being asked, with no particular agenda beyond the simple, radical act of accuracy. Thank you, she said. He turned from the window. He looked at her with the dark gray eyes, and the expression on his face was the one she had not been able to categorize and could now see more clearly, which was the expression of someone who has found something they were not looking for and intends to be very careful with it. Don't thank me for this, he said. This is the minimum. He paused. The 20 minutes on Damien Rowe will be on my desk by the time you're back from imaging. What happens after that is not something you need to be involved in or informed about. But it will happen. He said it with the same evenness he brought to everything, the same quality of statement rather than declaration, and she believed it with the total, uncomplicated certainty of someone who has spent enough time around dangerous men to recognize the kind whose danger is oriented away from them rather than toward them, and who understands, in the most animal and immediate sense, the difference. She stood up, carefully, with the particular care she had been exercising for 6 weeks, and which would now, she understood, be replaced by the actual treatment the injury required. And she collected her folio, and her phone, and her appointment card, and she walked toward the door with the limp she was no longer trying to hide, because hiding it had cost her 6 weeks of inadequate treatment, and Marco Corsetti had seen it anyway. And the specific energy required to maintain an invisibility that was not actually invisible was an energy she had just decided to reallocate. He moved to the door before she reached it and opened it, and as she crossed the threshold he said, quietly, Ms. Achebi. She stopped and looked back. Your work this morning was exceptional, he said. I want to be clear about that, separately from everything else. The position is yours. Completely. A pause. Come back when Dr. Vasquez clears you for full days. Not before. She looked at him in the doorway. at the severity of his face and the specificity of his attention and the particular quality of the man who had looked at her walk across a conference room and seen, in the restriction of a single movement, everything she had been managing for 6 weeks and 3 years and had decided, with the calm certainty of someone for whom decision and action occupied the same breath, that none of it was going to continue unaddressed. She nodded once, and she turned, and she walked toward the elevator with a gait that was honest rather than managed, and behind her the door of conference room 4 closed with a soft, definitive click, and somewhere in the building a profile was being assembled on a name she had just spoken aloud for the first time in 6 weeks, and somewhere a physician was preparing referrals, and somewhere a driver named Marcus was receiving an instruction, and all of these things were happening because she had walked into a room 22 minutes late, and a man had noticed, in the specific way that very few people notice anything, that she was limping. Simone Achebe walked into that building carrying 6 weeks of an injury she had been calling something other than its name, and 3 years of a life she had been managing with every tool available to her, except the one that required another person to see it clearly, and she walked out of it with an appointment card and a driver and the particular, fragile, unfamiliar weight of having been seen by someone who had no obligation to look and who had looked anyway, completely, with the full attention of someone who intended to do something with what they found. Damien Rowe learned, in the days that followed, that the specific cost of what he had done on a staircase 6 weeks ago was not a number his lawyers could settle and not a consequence his network could redirect, because the woman he had dismissed as someone without advocates had walked into the wrong building on the wrong morning and been noticed by the one man in the city whose attention, once engaged on someone's behalf, was the most consequential force available. If you love this story of a woman who thought she was alone in what she was carrying until someone looked close enough to see the weight of it, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that being seen by the right person at the right moment can change the entire shape of what comes next. And subscribe for more stories where the women everyone underestimated find, in the most unexpected places, exactly the people who were built to stand beside them.